Awesome. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you all so much for coming to our last computational social science talk of the semester. Unfortunately, we will have lots more in the fall, though, so stay tuned. If you want to be added to the listserv, let Hongo or I know. But I'm delighted to introduce to you today Professor Bale from Duke, where he's a professor of sociology, political science, and public policy, and created and leads the Polarization Lab, where he studies political tribalism, extremism, and social psychology using all sorts of computational tools. He has two books, Breaking the Social Media Prism and Terrified, How Anti-Muslim Fringe Organizations Became Mainstream. He's written for and had his work covered by numerous outlets, from the New York Times to the Wall Street Journal to the Atlantic. He's the editor of the Oxford University Press series in computational social science and the co-founder of the Summer Institutes in computational social science. So really a leader in our field here of computational social science. So today, Professor Bale is going to be talking about some of his work applying large language models to improve communication around divisive topics online. So
thank you. Thanks very much, Sam. Thank you all for coming. It's my first time to Carnegie Mellon. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here, and I look forward to meeting all of you. Some of you I know already, but I think most of you are I have not met, which is particularly exciting. So thank you for coming. I had circulated. Did we circulate the paper for this? Just out of curiosity.
The archive.
Yes.
I believe.
Cool. Okay. So the paper for today should have been circulated. I've got another link at the end if you want to check out this work in more detail. Like Sam said, I'm by training a social scientist with strong interests in computational social science, and specifically sort of foundational models and generative AI lately, and have just general interests in how these models can improve social science, not just the topic I'll talk about today, but other things like coding documents and agent-based models and all sorts of stuff. So I'm hoping that if we have a time for Q&A, we can maybe go beyond the paper a little bit too, which is, by the way, I think the first time I presented this, so very brand new. So it has many flaws, all of which are due to me and not my brilliant collaborators, all at BYU, especially Lisa Argyle, who led this project. So a little bit of background. As Sam mentioned, I lead a research group that's principally concerned with diagnosing the root causes of political polarization on social media, but we also do a lot of work trying to design new technology to incentivize more pro-social behavior on social media platforms and other online spaces. And in the past, we've done a lot of work with sort of peer-to-peer kind of chat setups, and sort of our big picture vision is to create what we call the social media accelerator, which is a hopefully open source research environment where researchers can sort of spin up different types of social media environments and then pay people to use it. And so I'll sort of nod to some of that past work, but I mention it now mostly to say that this project grew out of that project. We had a large field experiment looking at peer-to-peer chat and different levels of anonymity, and we're interested in how anonymity shaped political polarization. And out of that, we got a ton of sort of neat training data and a bunch of knowledge about how to run field experiments in this area. So a little bit of a history. For the talk today, I'll focus mostly on some of the social science theory for the first part of the talk. So the big picture idea here is to use evidence-based interventions identified principally, though not exclusively, in social science, and then see if we can train a large language model to help humans enact them. And so there'll be a little bit of, it'll be sort of heavier on the theory side than the technical side, but there'll be some challenges related to causal inference and attrition if there are people interested in those issues here. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking about the research design and how we tried to assess how the intervention worked. This was sort of a hands-off intervention. We didn't force anybody to use a large language model. We gave them the option. And so there's a lot of interesting questions about sort of human AI interaction, we think, and under what circumstances people are willing to use these tools and how they change people's behavior. So we can do a lot with the text generated on the platform that we created to look at how the intervention changes the way people talk. in this case about gun control. Unfortunately, the whole talk will be limited to the United States. We are currently exploring ways of scaling this to other places, specifically the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa, regions that have similar challenges related to political polarization and other kinds of conflict. Okay, so at a place like Carnegie Mellon, you don't need to say that millions of people or maybe even billions of people engage on the internet and social media each day, right? So there's commonplace. But I think one thing that there's sort of growing evidence of is we have a polarization problem. We have probably a decline in the quality of discourse. If by quality we mean things like civility and people finding common ground. And I think we've got just sort of people moving in many different directions at once because it's such a new research area. And really, we lack the sort of foundational body of research that would say exactly which interventions work where. And I've tried as part of some interdisciplinary teams to try to identify some of these interventions, specifically in this piece, which was led by Kurt Gray at UNC down the street from me. I and a bunch of co-authors tried to take stock of which interventions seemed to work in reducing partisan animosity. So we think what we've done in this project can scale beyond politics, but for the time being, we're sort of focused on political polarization, and again, in the United States, and even more narrowly on the issue of gun control. We hope to do some follow-ups with different issues in different places. But for now, we wanted to test out some of these interventions. And these were sort of crowdsourced attempts to identify key drivers of polarization and political instability. And one of the sort of, we're not going to use AI to transform political structures anytime soon, probably. We're probably, well, I don't know, maybe public discourse will change. We could probably have an interesting conversation about that. But we're really interested in this relationship building area of the intervention space, specifically how you might encourage people to build better dialogue skills and foster more positive kinds of contact. In the big picture, a lot of my research program is focused on incentivizing pro-social behavior, because I worry we focus too much on targeting negative behavior. And I worry that a lot of those interventions have sort of minimal impact and we could sort of get more bang for our buck and more scalable and cost-effective interventions if we focused on sort of nudging people towards more positive behavior. So we're sort of bracketing all this other stuff, which definitely matters, and just trying to drill down into the dialogue building skills. So when my co-authors and I sort of scan the social science literature for evidence of what seems to produce better dialogue and better conversation, we're not out to, in one single study, change people's minds about an issue. If you study political persuasion, you'll know this is an exceptionally rare phenomenon. Most people don't change their minds very often, but we have a sort of more modest goal, which is just to produce positive conversation quality. So we want to generate, the conditions where people can meaningfully agree to disagree, where they can at least reach some level of mutual understanding. And so, there are a number of different interventions, as I just noted. And when we looked at the evidentiary basis for each of them, we found that 3 of them particularly stand out. So the first is what's often called active listening. So here, the idea is that 2 people who are in having a difficult conversation about an issue like gun control, they can really improve the dialogue if they just show that they are listening to each other. And one of the most important ways to do that is just to be able to restate someone else's view back to them before you make your own point. Pretty simple stuff, right? But in the landscape of especially American politics, it's often missing from the debate, right? Civility, so politeness, turns out goes a long way, right? If you can set the tone of conversations, and we have some nice evidence of this from our own lab, but also from field experiments on Reddit and other places, if you can sort of set the norms in terms of, encouraging, incentivizing civility, maybe that will sort of set the tone for conversation rather than sort of letting most political conversations become a free-for-all, which is, I think, what happens sort of in the wild on social media. And the third one, again, none of this is probably super surprising to any of you. We're just looking for the interventions that seem to have the most the most explanatory power in producing better conversations. The third is just validating each other's views. So, re-communicating someone else's view back to them in the language that they appreciate. So, if we, too often we sort of, I think, especially in American politics, talk past each other and don't acknowledge that particularly Republicans and Democrats have different value systems, and that, if we don't sort of acknowledge one's right to have a different moral universe, it's very hard to have a meaningful conversation, even if we're not ready to cede that ground. And I think that's a very important point that we should come back to. So these three interventions, active listening, civility, and sort of value translation, are really central not just to the academic landscape, but to quite literally dozens of nonprofit organizations that try to enact these around dinner tables or around coffee shops. And these groups like Braver Angels and the Burke Payne Society spend quite a bit of time training people to do sort of conflict mediation, and then, obviously, pay for dinner and create the conditions where people can sort of hopefully, and there's a fair amount of evidence, including some randomized controlled trials of like putting these things out into the field that suggest most of the time these have a really positive impact. There's even one study from the political scientist Matthew Lewandowski that says a 15-minute conversation that's sort of carefully structured by one of these groups in a library can move intergroup attitudes on a 100-point scale, where 100 is very positive and 0 is very negative, between Republicans and Democrats, about 15 points. So 1 point per minute is pretty good, especially considering that these are pretty divided groups at the moment. So the question we wanted to ask is, how can we scale all this up? Again, it's enormously time intensive. There's training involved. There's getting people together. There's often great geographical divides. There's cultural divides. There's all sorts of reasons and why people might not want to participate. But then even after they do participate, these are often very difficult to facilitate and moderate conversations. Yeah.
Would you mind sharing your screen?
Sure. Yeah. Sorry. Is it working now?
It's updating.
Okay. Maybe if I go from presenter view, is it gone again?
Could you try going?
Sure. Yeah.
It's not.
Okay.
It's a separate window that needs to be shared.
Oh, I see. Okay. Sorry. So let me start the. No problem. Thanks for stopping me. Sorry, I've got a display issue here. I don't think this is gonna work though. Don't think so. Swap shows. Actually not sure where sorry, one sort of hackish way to do this might be to just not go full screen. I don't know. That's sort of not a great. Sorry, I've lost my mouse. Yeah. Unless anybody has better ideas,
share desktop one.
Oh, share the whole desktop. Yeah, good idea. Okay, good idea. Yeah. Then you guys can see all the text from my kids and my students, and yeah, all the political acrimony I get myself into. Okay, how about that? Still no? We got it. Okay, great. Okay, thanks for your patience, everybody. No problem. Okay, so how do we scale up these nonprofit groups? Valuable though very time-intensive efforts. And again, even these groups will tell you they're not out to change minds overnight. they're really interested in increasing the perception of people's perception of being understood by another person in the conversation. And so we have sort of three outcomes that we measure in this study. The first is a multidimensional index of conversational quality, which essentially includes a bunch of items like, do you think the other person understood you? Did you yourself feel understood? Were the reasons that the person gave for their argument high quality? So they're not just about they're not really only about quality in the sense of whether you liked it or not. They're also about the content of the conversation, whether you thought it was valuable and sort of moving, if not, if not changing your views, which we sort of didn't really expect to move, just given the large body of evidence that, again, political persuasion is very difficult. But we were hoping to at least increase the quality of conversation and reduce perceived divisiveness. So this is sort of a separate index. I'll get into the items that go into the indices in a minute, which sort of measures things like toxicity and ad hominem comments and things like that. Okay. So just like, I don't need to say very much about social media at a place like Carnegie Mellon. It feels kind of crazy to have a slide about what an LLM is, but I'm pretty sure everybody here knows what a large language model is, but just in case you don't, we're looking at these foundational models trained on extremely large amounts of data that use some kind of context window and in a generative manner predict likely text given a set of prompts. So of course, these are sort of probabilistic, so we can get different kinds of outcomes. And of course, models like GPT-3, which we use in this study, can produce a lot more text and a much bigger context window, and can produce much more, complicated and somewhat, well, arguably reasonable responses. I want to get into some of the limitations in a little bit too, than say this simple sort of glove model here. But I'm sure you all talk a lot about sort of the dangers and concerns around these models. I mean, for me, probably the biggest concern would be the potential for some kind of malicious actor to repurpose large language models, especially a particularly persuasive or compelling large language model that seems to be capable of impersonating humans. And I think there's increasing evidence that, at least for small bits of text, the models are getting very, very good at doing this, that this could potentially foment polarization, that it could increase misinformation, especially in the absence of watermarks or some other, broadly adopted technique for identifying large language models as such. And this, to say nothing of the many smaller models that could still do a lot of harm. We also have a lot of concerns, of course, about bias, fairness in this space, and also ethics in the research space. Is it ethical to expose someone to a large language model unknowingly? I think is a largely unanswered question, but a hugely consequential one, particularly if the models have the potential to become abusive or biased or otherwise create these sort of negative outcomes that I think many of us have seen from tools like ChatGPT. So rather, our original idea, like this was 5 years ago when we were playing around in this space, was to basically put an LLM in between two people who didn't agree, and then have the LLM try to translate their messages between the two of them, sort of act as a broker, but not tell the people that this was happening. Once we thought about this a little more, and especially because the models were much, much worse back then, this was a very bad idea for both logistical reasons and also for ethical reasons. But when we revisited the idea sort of around when GPT-2 came out, we realized that rather than sort of force the AI onto people, we could sort of give it as an elective option. So as you'll see, the way we set up the study is basically the participants in this experiment get offered, half of them get offered an AI chat assistant, and they're sort of allowed to opt into using it, and if the chat assistant provides them different options. This comes at the cost of major issues around attrition, as I'll discuss. So the causal inference becomes a lot trickier, but we think like it sort of draws a nice path around the ethical issues and the dangers. We did a lot of pre-testing with the tool, of course, to try to rule out concerns and dangers, particularly because we had people talking about gun control, which is, of course, a particularly dangerous topic for people to discuss at this kind of scale with such a new technology. So the big picture ideas here is, can we repurpose GPT-3 in this case for more productive outcomes, and can it encourage people to help others feel understood? Okay. So if you like, I mean, and when we talk to social media companies about this, they like to put it in the language of moderation, right? Can language models act like a human moderator? And, of course, we all know, I think those of us who study social media, how important content moderation can be. There's really good evidence from Reddit, really good evidence from Twitter, I think. And sort of an interesting question is, can an AI kind of come anywhere near a human moderator? We're not going to have that one-to-one comparison in this paper, though we're hoping to go in that direction in future work. And the context, again, is a sort of peer-to-peer, just a simple chat, really. Don't think social media, it's just chat windows, basically. An online conversation where people are prompted to talk about gun regulation. So essentially, how much regulation should there be on gun ownership in the United States? The sample is about 1,574 people. If folks are interested, I can talk a lot more about the sample. It's obviously not a representative sample because you can't just get anybody to do this, right? It's a bit of a pain to use a new online platform, and then also there's selection into like the types of people who are willing to, well, one, use a new platform, and two, talk to someone else. A lot of people in this sort of survey taking business might not like to do this. So I can talk a lot about some of the selection that happens along the way. And basically what we do is we have a pre-chat survey. So they get a Qualtrics survey. So Qualtrics, in case folks don't know, is this online survey platform. And we use the data from, we take the data from the Qualtrics survey, we pipe it into a matching algorithm where we match people who are in the study at the same time, who have opposing views on gun regulation. So one sort of wants more gun regulation, the other wants less gun regulation. Then half of the people who are matched then get redirected to a chat room. They're prompted to begin sharing their views on the issue. And then after exchanging a few views on the issue, our intervention starts, and I'll explain that in another slide. Basically, some chat rooms are randomly assigned suggestions from a large language model, specifically GPT-3, that follow either our active listening, civility, or value translation prompts. And then after they have the chats, they get immediately redirected to a similar survey, and we pick up our outcomes through a difference between the post and pre-chat. We also did a follow-up a few months out to see if the effects persisted, and remind me if I forget to talk about that. So here's how the intervention actually looks. So you have these are people in the treatment condition. So in the non-treatment condition, they're just chatting with each other without GPT-3. So you have someone who says, guns are a stain on democracy. Then, an opponent of gun control says, guns help us protect democracy. These are paraphrases, aren't real people. And then, in a typical online space that's maybe unmoderated, you might expect things to go downhill pretty quickly, right? And these are probably this is probably a pretty tame version of what could actually happen, right? So here's where GPT-3 comes in. So GPT-3 takes that last post and it passes that as a prompt alongside a set of instructions about one of these three theories. So either active listening, civility, or sort of validation and value translation. So basically the prompt is, hey, GPT-3, please make 3 versions of this message that someone's about to send, read the last few exchanges, and then restate it in a manner that demonstrates active listening or is more civil, or and so on and so forth. And then, if the person likes, they can choose one of these alternatives, so that we give them just the ability to click and say, I want to send this message instead of the other one. We always use one of the 3 prompts, so one of the 3 types of prompts, but they always get 3 different choices. But those 3 different choices come from the same intervention. So you get 3 ways of restating your views, 3 ways of So we actually haven't done this yet. We haven't like teased out the effects by different types of interventions, but that's possible given the design. So the person in this case chose one of the restate prompts. I understand that you value guns. And then hopefully the theory goes that the conversation will improve in quality. Yeah.
What triggers the intervention?
Oh, sorry, just the third one of the, so we only treat one of the two people in the conversation, and it comes in the experimental condition after they send a third message.
So every single message is also accompanied by a, hey, GPT suggests these alternatives.
After the third message.
After the
Yeah,
third
yeah,
message.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, no problem. Good question. Sorry, first time I presented this, so I'm sure I'm missing other stuff too. Yeah, Sam,
There's a
yeah.
question online about, did you just have the model rephrase, or did you actually give a different prompt for like the rephrasing, like giving the 3 examples of a restate?
So the question, did we give it
Different prompts, like
yes,
okay.
yeah.
Okay.
But there was no fine tuning of the model or anything. Like, this is just off the shelf GPT-3. So like you could probably do better with, a more bespoke model is my guess. But, yeah. Any other questions? Okay. So this is again what the respondents actually saw. So here we're looking at the mobile view. It was also available on the web. It's just a web-based app. So you can see, the person can choose one of these 3 messages, choose to send their original message. And interestingly, this is one of the outcomes that I think is particularly interesting. They can also decide to edit their own message. And I don't know if folks have read this really interesting dissertation out of Cornell Tech by Maurice Jaquesh, but he has this interesting finding that people, when prompted to use AI tools, tend to change their own minds instead of other people's minds. Sort of an interesting, I don't know what's going on there, but it's fascinating. So we did see people either send one of the GPT-3 messages, send their original message, or edit their original message after seeing the GPT-3 message and then send that. So there's sort of a lot. Again, causal inference is just a lot of fun here. It's messy, but we think sort of interesting. Okay, so even though we started out with a fairly large sample from a reputable survey company, Bovitz, we started out with 2,600 people. You can see here we lost people at every single stage. So we matched 2,113 people from the original survey. A lot of the people who were matched, or some of the people who matched, then didn't actually participate. Some people joined the chat room. Sorry, these are the people who joined the chat room and never participated. We still picked up their outcomes there. And then once they got into the chat room and were talking, though, many people stayed in the chat room. So that's good news, except, and we've learned this from other peer-to-peer studies, it's really hard to keep both people in the room the whole time. If the doorbell rings in the middle of the conversation, someone can flake out if they lose Wi-Fi, right? There's a lot of different reasons why this happens. So unfortunately, we have just a lot of attrition from the beginning to the end. So only 45% of the 1,574 who took the post-survey had a full-length conversation, which we defined as about a 15-minute conversation. Yeah, Hero. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. About 15 minutes. I know we've actually looked at actual time. I don't have the number. The average. Some of them did go over, basically. Sorry. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really tricky. So we have this earlier study I mentioned on anonymity. We did this at a national scale again with a different survey firm, YouGov, and what we discovered there is you sort of have to batch a lot of these, because, for example, if you have, like you've got a lot of Democrats on the East Coast and a lot of Republicans in Central or Mountain Time. You run into these issues of it's like just about dinner time in the East Coast when it's right, or you wind up with like the only Democrat in Idaho at that moment, right? And which is sort of strange. There's Democrats in Idaho, I joke, but you know what I mean. You do run into some pretty weird issues. We also, in that study, we were matching on actually 5 different variables or sort of covariates. So that was particularly challenging. So given the challenge with that study, we went with a sort of more simplistic approach here. And by the way, we sort of talked a lot about matching on party, so like putting Republicans and Democrats together, but there's actually a surprising amount of heterogeneity on this issue across parties. So you have a surprising amount of, well, if you're a Democrat, maybe a surprising number of Republicans who actually prefer regulation and vice versa. So that's why we've matched on that attitude. Yeah. We also, it's tricky. The other tricky thing with this kind of study that we've learned from, we tried a few different issues. Like we have people talk about immigration sometimes, gun control other times, climate change other times. And what we find is the tricky thing is like there's a sweet spot between a topic that's like unbridgeable, right? Like the Oxford comma or something like that, right? And then something where there's like too much overlap, like we all don't like inflation, right? Or I mean, you can imagine it getting political, who's to blame and all that kind of stuff. But we found in a lot of pre-testing that gun control is sort of a sweet spot between those two. But it does, of course, impose limitations on how far this can generalize. And that's one of the reasons why we want to replicate in other sets. Yeah.
Did you ever observe the model having information?
Yeah, that's exactly where I'm headed. So if I may, I'll just go on to the next slide here. So the very first thing we wanted to do is figure out, did the model do what it was supposed to, right? Because like if we do observe effects, or if we don't observe effects, the worst case scenario is we don't know what's driving those effects. And of course, we're storing all the text. And so we just use some sort of, crude off the shelf, like, Perspective API is, for those of you who use it, it's Google's proprietary content moderation tool. It's maybe 80% accurate. It's not the greatest, but it probably means something. And green here means these things, the intervention increased these things, and red means it decreased them. So overall, and I'll show you some more content-based stuff to answer your question a little more fully in a minute. But as you can see, overall, it looks like for most of these sort of positive politeness outcomes and non-toxic outcomes. So Perspective is really trained to identify abusive language and hate speech and things like that. This is, of course, what we're really worried about. We don't want GPT-3 engaging in any kind of hate speech. And of course, we had a very, very extensive testing process and a lot of slow launches before we put this out into the field, because we were genuinely very concerned that something might happen. And we had a process in place to shut down the study if something did, and so on and so forth. But fortunately, as you can see, we see decreased toxicity in all the GPT-3 rephrasings. We also, sorry.
How do I make sense of the effect sizes here? So the toxicity changes by 0.021.
Yeah.
Like 1 in 5 conversations don't have something bad, or how do I read that effect size?
That's a really good question. I don't have on the tip of my tongue, one of my collaborators did this analysis, so I'm going to have to punt the question to him after the talk and hopefully follow up with you. But my recollection is this, unless anybody here knows the Stanford politeness package really well on the scale, which is rank stuff. My recollection is it's like a 0-1 kind of thing. So I think these are small effects, but not infinitesimally small effects. Yeah. No questions. Okay, so what did people talk about and what was rephrased is, of course, a really important question for us. So, newly attuned to the great powers of large language models, we thought, why don't we have a large language model do the coding for us? So this is sort of first cut of the data. Either that or we're really lazy, maybe a little from column A, a little from column B. But so we asked GPT-3 to read through all the conversations and assign them topical labels. And so you can see, the model finds people talking about mental health, talking about schools, talking about arming teachers, talking about background checks, and things of this nature. So you can see there's a lot of different topics discussed, and these are the colors here. And then this sort of subgraph here shows which types of messages were rewritten. And so what we think we're seeing is that for the most part, the intervention rewrote on all sorts of different topics. So it both changed the style, but it also was used equally across these different topics. I have a lot of extra slides that look into who used it when. The sort of general takeaway from there is, first of all, lots of people used it, many more than we thought. Again, there's some by the time people get into the environment and are there, they're sort of a weird person in the greater sense of things, right? There is, again, not a representative sample, but then we wanted to know, for example, like, were Democrats going to be more likely to use this than Republicans? Turns out no, equal probability across a 7-point ideology spectrum. Were older people less likely to use this than younger people, maybe because they don't know about AI? So it turns out no, including an 80-year-old who accepted every rephrasing, which, we can't know that they knew what they were doing, but they seemed to like it, or maybe they had just really fat thumbs and couldn't distinguish, or not bad eyesight, let's not say that, and couldn't distinguish the buttons or something like that. And actually, in a lot of our UX research, we see stuff like this happen, so that might actually explain. The two areas where we did see greater uptake, women were slightly more likely than men to use the tool, and highly educated people were slightly more likely to use the tool than less well-educated people, which is sort of consistent with the research we've seen on sort of algorithms and knowledge of what algorithms can do, and sort of, but it also is presumably the segment of the population that would be most concerned about harm and fairness in AI. So, we can't make a lot of it. Yeah.
How do you get the position of nodes in the graph?
Oh, this is just a PCA on the, or so again, one of my co-authors made this plot. I believe it's just a PCA on the topic conversation matrix. Yeah. And then it's fancy k-means, something like that. Yeah. Again, this is sort of a first cut at the data because we wanted to know what it's talking about. Many of us have read a lot of the conversation, so we have a little more deeper knowledge of what was talked about, but it sort of gives us a broad overview, we hope, of the types of things that we're talking about. Okay, so getting into the effects here. Again, causal inference is a big challenge. We have, not only sort of a one-way intervention, so only one person gets treated in the conversation, and the expected effects are on the conversation partner. So, if Patrick and Hongbo are talking and we treat Hongbo, we don't expect Hongbo's attitudes to change, but we expect Patrick's to change because he sees the rephrased messages, right? There's also an interesting question I want to come back to at the end about whether Hongbo's views also change. Turns out maybe, but the key thing we want to see is whether Patrick's views change. So we run a bunch of different models. First, we just have a simple intent to treat effect, which is obviously really noisy because of all the attrition. But just because folks usually like to see ITT effects, we report those in some of the graphs that will follow. And then we have two versions of a complier average causal effect model. So here we do some version of one of two versions of that. The one you'll see is a two-stage least squares. So the first stage is assignment to treatment, and then the second stage we instrument that for compliance with assignment to treatment. We've also done a lot with the number of rephrasings people accepted, because one thing you could argue is if people only rephrase one thing, you wouldn't expect a big effect on their partner, and you'd like to see the more that people use the tool, the more the findings increase. So we'll report the findings across a lot of different levels of compliance. Yeah.
Did the people know that their partner had access to this? No.
They did not. I mean, we can't know for certain, but we didn't tell them. Yeah.
Did any of the people become suspicious that this was happening? Like,
the only way we would know, we had some like demand effects, like what do you think was the purpose of this study? Nothing like super suggestive there. We had an open-ended question, any other thoughts on the study, but you can't really depend, in my experience, you can't really depend on those, right? People just sort of gloss over those or don't respond. So I don't think we can really know for certain. Yeah. There's one other thing I wanted to say about the previous screen. What was it? Well, hopefully we'll come back. Any other questions? Okay, so we have, again, sort of three main outcomes: conversation quality, which is an index, divisiveness, which is an index, and then their actual views on gun control. And basically what you'll see here is people give each conversation. So this is a pre-validated instrument from research in political science. And basically, it combines, again, a lot of different elements of conversation quality. So people give it a grade. They talk about the level of stress, whether they felt heard and understood, whether they treated their partner with respect and felt that they were respected. And then importantly, whether they were able to influence their partner and able to communicate values and beliefs. We have broken these down out of the index, and they seem to all move in the same direction. But certainly, there's probably some interesting questions about the difference between influence and perception of respect and things like that. There's also probably some Dunning-Kruger kind of stuff going on to the extent that Dunning-Kruger still exists. People sort of overestimating their own influence, and there's a lot of interesting questions in social psychology about how people tend to overestimate their own influence, of course, but then that also makes them feel like the conversation went better. So there's some, there's a lot moving in different ways here. So let's start with the conversation quality results. So here's the mean value of the conversation quality index pre and post treatment. And we are subsetting by the number of rephrasings in the intervention. And so the important line we think is the blue line here. This is how much your conversation quality index changed post to pre if your partner, your conversation partner with whom you were discussing gun control for 15 minutes, received the opportunity to rephrase their messages with GPT-3. So it's not whether or not they did, that's coming. This is just the intent to treat effect up at the top there. So you can see there's a significant difference, small but significant difference between the control condition and then GPT itself. So getting back to the Hongbo-Patrick question, Patrick's views, at least according to the intent to treat effects, seem to move. Hongbo's do not for conversational quality. And the nice thing that we were sort of eager to see is that the more people use the rephrasings, the more the perceived conversation quality seems to increase. So here you can see, particularly when people use 4 or more rephrasings, we see, compared to the intent to treat effect, we see a general increase. The more people use the rephrasings, the more their partner seems to rate the conversation as having high quality. And then here's some other models that generally say the same thing, we think, with the two-stage least square model.
I don't understand the control though. Sorry.
Control here is just people who had the conversation, but neither of the people in the conversation had the GPT-3 intervention.
So why does the control move with the number of rephrasing interventions?
I think it's just, this is something where this is a sort of a not completely answered question, but we think that it's just the more people exchange messages in general, the more the conversation quality improves. So like if you have a long conversation, that tends to be, because shorter conversations would,
you're matching on all the other variables.
Yeah.
And so okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so conversation quality tends to improve as expected, and that was one of our pre-registered hypotheses here. Then we have this divisiveness index. So first we use these pretty widely used thermometer ratings. So again, 0 to 100, what do you think of your partner, where 100 is very warm and 0 is very cold? And this is a very well validated metric that's used in the American National Election Study, many other high profile studies over many years. Then I think these are sort of some of the more interesting measures that go into the index. Was it difficult to see the point of view of people with whom you disagreed? Did you consider it important to imagine how things look from their perspective? I understand people have good reasons for voting differently on the issue of gun control, and I respect the opinions of people who disagree with me. So it's sort of like how productive is the divisiveness measure, if you like. And again, when we break these out, we see similar stuff happening in similar directions. Okay, so same thing, intent to treat effects. Here we want divisiveness to go down. We wanted conversation quality to go up. So in the ITT, it's not a significant difference, but suggestive in the right direction. And then when we adjust for the number of conversations in compliance, again, we see people whose partner got suggested rephrasings from GPT-3, especially the more they got and used, the more their discussion partner, the more the people whose discussion partners got the rephrasings and used them, the more their rating of the divisiveness of the conversation decreased. That's a mouthful. Yeah, Hiro.
Is that not only they see that information, but also they use.
That's they use it. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
That means messages does not comply.
I don't know the answer to that. I think one again, I think one of my co-authors has run this analysis and I just can't quite remember. My recollection is there's a small suggestive effect, but it's not something that, you know, we would be sort of noteworthy or worth, or, you know, significant enough to report. Yeah.
So here is also is that notion.
Yes, two people just talking about gun control. Yeah, yeah. Okay. So lastly, this is either good news or bad news, depending on who you ask. So these are whether your actual attitudes about gun control change. And again, we didn't think we were going to move gun control attitudes because it's hard to move attitudes in general, especially in 15 minutes, especially with a stranger talking to you, especially on a very charged issue like gun control. And indeed, we did not see any substantial differences across the different, no matter how much people use GPT-3. If anything, and gets back to the Patrick Hongbo comparison here, maybe Hongbo's views changed more than Patrick's, which is sort of fascinating to me. You know, maybe being shown an alternative way to think sort of makes you reflect on your own biases in an interesting way, although that difference is also not significant. So I don't think we want to make too much of that. And, you know, when we first presented this, like a lot of our team was sort of disappointed. They were like, oh, it didn't, you know, it made conversations better, but it didn't really move anything. And then the other half of the team was like, good, we didn't want to build an AI that actually can influence people, right? That's sort of a scary prospect, especially getting back to the negative uses of this stuff, right? If it could, for example, persuade people to change their minds, that's pretty concerning when you think about a malicious version of this study, right? So now this is GPT-3, who knows, GPT-4, Claude, whatever, you know, there's a lot of different models maybe could do better, yeah. Sorry, we didn't have repeat participants. Yeah, yeah. No, yeah, we weren't able to look at that. I mean, it is a study we thought about running. One thing we noticed from earlier research, and it sort of like, again, partly inspired this. We have a paper coming out in Nature Human Behavior that reports on the results of this anonymity study. We're trying to figure out whether anonymous conversation is productive or counterproductive. And one thing we found that's very suggestive of the sort of timing and the repeated exposure effects, that your dosage effects, if you like, that you're talking about, is basically, you know, there's a little bit of a roulette in a chat roulette going on. If your partner happens to be, you know, a big jerk, it's going to start off on the wrong foot and it's going to derail really quickly. But if you get matched with like one of these magical civil people, right? Civility begets civility. We see this in the text data over time. So the best conversations have a different trajectory than the others. And so one of the ideas here was like, can we induce that change? So what we don't know, though, which I think would be really interesting, is can civility carry over from one conversation to another? So like, yeah, if we could redo the study, take the people who got the civility prompt and then match them with someone who's a jerk, see what happens, right? That would be amazing. But again, getting all the people into the chat room at the same time is hard enough. Getting, you know, someone who took this study recently, it's really, really hard, especially when we don't control the sample. We're working with a survey firm to pull this off, and they hate us already because of all the complexity. So it's, yeah.
Just want to make sure I understand something. With the 4+ people say, right?
Yeah.
Could an alternate explanation be somebody who's more likely to accept an AI suggestion is also more likely to have a nicer, more polite conversation?
Yeah, it's interesting. So getting back to I mean, I can only, so we have looked at we have looked at behavioral outcomes, if you like. So like we can look at not just these survey measures, but whether the text actually changed. Like, so like getting back to our example where Hongbo got the treatment, but Patrick did not, like, does Patrick become more civil in the way he writes in response to Hongbo, right? We do see that. So when we pass through the, all of the data, not just to see whether the AI worked, but whether it induced a language change on the partner, we do see effects there. Small, but we think significant effects. I can't offer a really perfect answer to your question because we don't really measure pre-treatment someone's like propensity to be civil, right? So there's like all these weird interaction effects that go on. All we know is age, gender, political ideology, income, and again, there all we see is women more likely to use it, and slightly educated, educated people, highly educated people, so not BA, but like BA, above BA, more likely to use it. And to the extent that, I don't know, we could talk about whether above BA people are more civil than others, right? But if that's true, then it would square with your hypothesis, yeah.
But that's the kind of worry that you're trying to address with this control.
Yeah, exactly. So hopefully some of that gets addressed by the randomization, yeah, sure, yeah. Other questions, yeah, Patrick, yeah.
Simon was talking about selection of influence. So is the self being influenced by the partner or by interacting with GPT-3? So they can kind of teach those apart.
Unfortunately, like what would have been awesome is to have a third treatment condition where both people got GPT, both people got the rephrasing, because then you could really get into these things. So I don't think, because all we can do is look at, the response to your partner's rephrasing, I don't think we can nail that question in a way that might satisfy, it's a great question, but I don't think we can answer it in a rigorous kind of way given the current design. There is this interesting series of studies in political science. There's this sort of like, broad tradition of so-called deep canvassing, which you probably know about, Patrick, but it's like basically, you send people into the field on a political influence campaign and you have them connect with people at like a narrative level, like very, a conversation. You don't just go and hand out a leaflet. The goal is to have a long conversation with people. And there's a science paper that shows, for transphobia, for example, if you send people to share personal experiences about what it's like to be trans, that this can move even in highly transphobic areas, this can move attitudes about trans people. And so this paper made a big splash, and many of you probably know it, but the interesting follow-up study, which came out I think last year, was that there's also an effect on the canvassers themselves. So the people who go out to do the canvassing also feel more warmly towards the transphobic people. So it's probably, if we're thinking about like, Rawlsian democracy norms and like the effect of like agreeing to disagree and, the value of the public square, all these intangibles, right? Part of it is this sort of emergent outcome that you're describing. I think that like it's supposed to make everybody, more generous and everybody more informed and everybody. So, I mean, the only evidence we have, which I think is not great, is just that this GPT self, seems to move a little more than GPT-3, depending on, maybe not here, but maybe here and in the ITC, but it's obviously nothing we'd like to hang our hat on. But there is this paper, Maurice Jakesh, Jakesch, that shows people who were asked to use AI to write a compelling argument to persuade others actually wound up persuading themselves. So it is a really interesting. Now, there's so many interesting questions here, right? Is it just that being exposed to different types of argumentation makes you reevaluate? Is it some kind of blind deference to AI, which is sort of my guess, right? Like that people think, oh, the AI is smarter than me, even though like we all know that, like debatable, but like both of those mechanisms could be going on. And given our design, like we just have no way of teasing that out. Yeah, but it's a really good question. Yeah.
I don't want to keep saying
no. Yeah, it's okay. So.
But on that, isn't it like an institute? And there's the possibility of suspicion of tools like used widely, right? And
yeah.
you think that like you could use it not just for user control, right? But for any kind of conversation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Pre-treatment be as effective as like an instant tool like this.
Pre-treat. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. Now we can finish the talk. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. So the question is, if it were more broadly adopted in great. Thank you. Thanks. Would we see a different outcome, or like, so in other words, is this just unique to the apparently weird group of people who do this kind of, is that the general question?
The general question is more like, do you think that large language models
In situ rather than as a pre-treatment? Oh, I see. So like would you expect different effects if for example, sorry, trying to do two things at once here. There we go. No problem. I'll dance on one foot and pat my head and chew gum or whatever it is. Okay. Yeah, it's a good question. I don't really have a strong sense, just only because we haven't compared pre-treatment to in situ. I can say, like, from the NGOs that do this kind of work, right? Like, a lot of it combines both. So they will do some kind of training before the actual conversations happen, and then they'll have a moderator as well. So my prior would be like doing both is probably best. But given that people are busy and generally uninterested in talking about divisive issues, probably a big ask, There's a lot of interesting nudges, like I was part of the Twitter, old Twitter incentives team, which as a academic advisor, they did a lot of really interesting work sort of nudging during this kind of nudging thing without large language models. So just simple interventions to dissuade toxicity, things like, hey, you're about to send a hateful message according to our classifier, do you maybe want to think about this? Nothing like you're wrong and stop, just like think about it, and that sort of friction the paper shows, which was I think ICWSM or something like that. Yeah, I think it was ICWSM, shows a significant drop in toxicity post intervention. So yeah, I guess it would be really interesting to do both, but we didn't do it, so I can't answer. It's a good question. Oh yeah. Good question. Yeah. So yeah, after we 3 months later we measure, everything goes away. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's mostly the thing is though, when you think about it, if I asked you to remember a conversation you had 3 months ago in general, right? Like how, it's a truly rare conversation that would stick in your mind, right? On the other hand, it's pretty rare to have a conversation with someone who disagrees with you these days. So maybe you might have expected more, but like in terms of whether you can remember what your, meaningfully sort of recall what your pre-treatment, ideas about feeling respected were, it's a little messy, but yeah, they go away.
Conversation quality has improved
Yeah. And to the repeated, exposure question and the dosage question, I think that would be really interesting, because that's certainly something the NGOs see is like, you get these people who become like, what do you call it? Like power persuaders, once they learn and get momentum and experience, they get better. So you would expect something like that, I think. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Speaking of timing, did you were you able to separate analyses for reasons?
Yeah, as I mentioned, that's on the to-do list. My recollection is they all three move the same way, and the reason that's not surprising to us is when we chose the intervention. So we had a universe of like 12 that had significant evidentiary basis, and we chose the 3 with the strongest evidentiary basis. So it seems like, and then of course we wanted to choose not only in terms of the evidentiary basis, but what GPT-3 was good at, right? So if it can't really do something more sophisticated, we don't want to say we're testing that when a GPT-3 isn't really doing that. So our Venn diagram was sort of like effective interventions and ones that GPT-3 can do really well. So that's how we wanted these 3. Yeah, and so it's not super surprising to us that they seem to move in the same direction. Yeah.
And then separately, because there are two prior messages before the intervention.
Yeah.
In terms of the toxicity or the between that or before that, we had people put that behavioral survey.
Right.
That,
so that's where like the behavioral indicators is that analysis that I was describing earlier compares the pre-intervention text to the post-intervention text. So not only whether the AI works, but whether the conversation partner changed in response to the intervention. So yeah, there is some kind of, if we had just done it, if we'd just done the randomization at the beginning of the conversation, I think the reason we didn't do it is we thought it would be a stronger case if we could show that it changed the trajectory of a conversation, which it seems to have done. Yeah.
Along the lines of changing the trajectory of the conversation, do you have a feature for participants to cancel their conversation if it becomes too toxic?
Yeah, they can definitely leave the conversation. I don't think we did have a block button. It's one of the ways, it was one of this is something we learned from our previous research too. There's many reasons to do this. The best one is because you want people to be able to avoid harassment, but there's also practical reasons, like you want that as a data point, right? I don't think we had any, in our last study, we did have one study we had to shut down because we allowed people to block each other. In this, we had a report user button, but nobody used it. So seems like they went well. Yeah, it seems like we did have one in a previous study though. Yeah, and basically the way we set it up, which is again non-trivial in terms of time and investment, but as every message goes through the system, it gets passed through Perspective API, and then if it gets flagged as higher than 0.80 on I think a scale from 0 to 1, that's the answer to the scale question. I think it is for Perspective. I know it's 0 to 1. That then triggers an email to the research team, and we had to staff a content moderation team to decide. But that only happened once in 2 studies of, let's see, probably total of 4,000 people. Actually, 3 studies, about 6,000 people. So yeah, it seems not to happen as often as I would have thought. Yeah. Yeah. Is there a question? Yeah.
What's happening in the
for the text, for the behavioral outcomes that I didn't show. Yeah.
It would be interesting. I mean, especially if you want to dive into understanding it as a moderation tool, where it determines whether the message has this sense of toxicity at some level.
Right.
That might, at some level, because having only a few messages.
Yeah.
What conversation?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good idea. It's sort of like that Twitter study I mentioned with this study together. Yeah, it would be interesting. Yeah, I mean, the one thing, and this sort of gets back to the previous question about toxicity and flagging toxicity, like my prior would be the toxic people are the least likely to use it and most likely to be pissed off, right? Like, especially in a sort of shadow, like in a world preoccupied with things like shadow banning and stuff like that, right? Like that they might somehow find that problematic. but I don't know. And certainly, like we're talking with a few platforms about implementing this at a much larger scale. The challenges there, as probably many of you know, are just huge. There's a lot of friction at the C-suite of these companies. So on the other hand, trying to move this beyond a kind of kumbaya, can we make a few people a little less mean? Like one way I like to think about this whole research agenda of incentivizing pro-social behaviors, you think about like the cost of content moderation per platform is huge. Like I think Facebook spends like 1.5 billion or something like that, right? So if you can nudge, even if you create like a 5% increase in civility or 5% drop in incivility, that's a lot of money. Yeah. So that's how we're trying to sell it to them. Also, content moderation, of course, is fraught for many different reasons, right? It's politicized. It's now whether GPT-3 is going to be political, right? A huge, complicated question. I'm sure you all have seen some of these studies that evince the bias. was a new question over here. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering if data from like the difference between when users start with their prompt and the amount of changes ChatGPT makes on top of that.
Like, what's the edit distance between the original text and the GPT-3 rephrasing?
It seems like people could be still divisive.
Yeah.
This is like
Right.
just some examples, like in the ones that you had in your example, like
Right.
I believe maybe it's like one of the prompts.
Yeah, this one.
It goes like the middle. So it's like, yeah.
This one.
Very divisive.
Oh, sorry. This is. Oh yeah, you're right. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah. I feel yeah. Right. Yeah.
What people have said.
Yeah.
What people originally vote, and then what they chose to do.
Right.
From like.
Yeah. I don't think we've looked at something like edit distance or more significantly, like, whether, some are more civil, some of these options are more civil than others. I didn't do the prompt engineering for this project, but my recollection is in the end, we decided to give it, so we had to give it a bounds because they have to fit in these little boxes. So I think the variance isn't giant, right? I think this is sort of an outlier, but obviously it's also a product of the input. So it's not something we've looked at systematically yet, but we could. We haven't done it yet. Yeah, it's a good idea. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Good question. Yeah. I think you haven't asked a question yet. Please. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you thought about the effect of like action information that has been added by the language. It's not
That's interesting.
about maybe changing the way how things are said, but it's like, for instance, in this last example that it feels like, I mean, I don't know if it's reasoning, but to me it feels like almost an argument for the thing that has been or would have been said.
Right.
So it's adding information in a way.
We thought a lot about, I mean, like, because we had these concerns about, for example, misinformation. In fact, just to give you a sense of how far we came, our very first attempt to, just naively, this might have been GPT-2, resulted in 32 expletives repeated in a row, right, from GPT-2, and it's like, whoa, we got a problem, right? So we did spend a lot of time like looking at how things are being rephrased, and for mostly for that, but also misinformation, right? Like, is it going to hallucinate and facts about gun control? And so a lot of the prompt engineering focused on changing style rather than content. So again, I think this is not this is sort of more of an exception to the rule. I'm wondering now, I'm trying to think, like, it'd be an interesting follow-up. I don't know that we can release all this text data just because of personally identifiable information and so on. But I'm trying to think of ways that we could still, I mean, something like the edit distance wouldn't get you the information quality. We did do at some point, I wish I had slides, but we did do like most common words changed, things like that. That was, again, more to measure style. And, I think like we would really worry if like, this said like 3D printed guns and then all of the interventions were down there, right? Like that would be very, very concerning. So we're, at least in this space, there is no obvious thing that jumps out, but there's a lot going on in these dots that we haven't scrutinized with the level of detail that you might want to do to answer your question thoroughly. Yeah.
I guess one thing you have is you know the original message in the topic.
Yeah.
The choices.
Yeah.
Somebody chooses. Do they choose to jump to a new topic, or do they choose to? Things, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Is the machine basically saying like, you could say that, but why not make it?
Right. Why not talk about the weather? Yeah. Yeah. It just derailed every conversation to Taylor Swift, and everybody just loves Taylor Swift so much that sounds like a Silicon Valley episode or something. Yeah.
Do you feel like you have an understanding for the cases of like any of the rephrasing?
Yeah.
one example might be, I don't like putting words in my mouth.
Right.
I would say.
Yeah. So we only have those open-ended questions about the, sorry, I had more slides, but I'm trying to get to, so another thing I left out, we trained people. So we showed people how this works. So the demographics, apart from the open-ended question, which is just like, what did you think of the study? Is there anything you want to tell us kind of questions? These are very crude, these are graphs undergrad just put together days ago, so take them with a grain of salt. But most of them, here's the percent accepted. This is our 80-year-old here, right? And then, but the one that sort of surprised me, like, so at least in the sort of public discourse, right? Like my prior would be maybe Republicans would be a little more concerned about AI censorship than Democrats because of the discourse around shadow banning. Now, you may also say Democrats are plenty concerned about fairness and bias in AI, but maybe they generally tend to accept at the same level, but dislike AI for different reasons. Like that could be plausible, but like to the extent that you buy the inference that Republicans would be less likely to do this if there was a whole story about, reluctance or like, especially to the extent that, at least if you talk to political psychologists, like conservatives tend to, prioritize things like liberty and, hands-off sort of, not strong-handed interventions. I would have thought you'd see more among conservatives than you saw. Yeah.
I'm also wondering if there's potential. If somebody speaks and types in
Types in a what? Yeah.
And the ChatGPT rephrases it very like custom sounding.
Yeah, definitely could be. One of the there's some interesting. I'm sure you've all seen this paper. I think it's a Stanford group that had GPT-3 and I think 4 take like 60 surveys. Have you seen this? Like, and sure enough, it's slightly liberal and it's slightly young and it's slightly educated, right? And I think just generally, except that you can train, except you can fix these things, maybe. But I think it does, it's a tool of the advantaged in the form that we use. So that'd be interesting. I don't think we looked at race. I know I don't have it in these slides. We do have race, so we could see whether there was a greater edit distance or something like that by race. That would presume that, people of different races were more likely to use different vernaculars, which might not be true. Like, so, maybe you'd want to condition on the use of racial language independent if you used it. But yeah, we haven't looked at that. So it's definitely possible. Yeah.
-5 to 5 scale. Someone who's on a 3 positive is matching the negative.
Yeah, it's a little more. I don't have the exact. Let's see. Entered chat. Here's our consort diagram. I don't think we have it up here. No, shoot. I was hoping we had the exact decision rule. Yeah, it's not 3 to. It's a more. It's a less extreme range. Yeah, I recall it's like 1 to -1 on a 6 point or 6 point -3 to 3 scale. Yeah.
So I'm just thinking if you have something that's really extreme, but then you have something
right.
That's more like I can be dense maybe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and there's an interesting in this book that in my recent book that Sam generously mentioned. I sort of well, I didn't come up with the idea, but I discovered, or maybe not discovered, but I finally read a great old study by Carolyn Sharif, who's the spouse of Muzafer Sharif, who was much more known for the social identity tradition. And she developed this theory called the latitude of acceptance, which is essentially that there's a nonlinear interaction between the ideological distance between any two people trying to persuade each other and their likelihood of persuading each other. So like basically what you say, right? If you have two people in the middle talking, you're going to get a lot more convergence than two people. And maybe at the extremes, it's actually going to backfire, right? That's why. And we did this bot study on Twitter years ago where we paid people to follow out-partisan bots. And we originally wanted to test that theory with like two different treatment conditions, the moderate and the extremist. But the problem with these kinds of studies and working with the survey firms is you just get so constrained of like who's willing to do this, you know, and that like they have these massive samples, but then it gets cut down to 2,000. And then within that 2,000, okay, well, we're going to lose, you know, we're going to have this crazy bias in terms of gender if we do this or whatever it is, right? So there's these trade-offs that make it really tricky. And then once you get into these compliance issues too, right, which we knew to expect to some degree, although there was probably a little more than most of us hoped, I think. You know, then you have to have these massive, so that all these all these design decisions become really more consequential. And we've learned to just try to do the simplest one. But that latitude of acceptance idea would be really interesting to test as a follow-up, you know, because you could also imagine a language model learning the latitude of acceptance and tailoring it to each person, right? Like that would be really fascinating. Yeah, I'd love to see that study. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you don't do this, right? But if you want to get really big effect size,
yeah.
You do.
Oh God. That's a leading question. Let's see. It's a good question though. I guess, you know, like there's one thing that I guess the answer is I don't really know, to be honest. I mean, the one thing that's really tricky is, are we seeing a persuasion effect or a learning effect, you know? And like, because you could argue, okay, people have their view about gun control, they enter into a conversation, they're just not going to change their mind, right? But if it's someone like, you know, like I have very little experience with handguns and firearms, I don't, you know, really know what I'm doing. And if I like met someone who, you know, knew a lot and could kind of educate me a little bit on like gun safety and things like that, like I probably have more potential to be persuaded that some people at some place should have guns, right? If on the other hand, I'm like a card carrying member of an anti-gun movement and, you know, have all these, you know, like it's going to be much harder to persuade me. So the question though, is it a persuasion effect or a learning effect, right? Like, am I sort of realizing the attitudes I would have had were I more informed, or am I changing a pre-existing attitude? And those are probably different processes. And here, because the intervention is really just about style, I think it's probably more the persuasion story. But if I had to say where you could get the most bang for your buck, if you wanted to like scale this and change a lot and change a lot of opinion, independent of whether it was learning or persuasion, I would say the learning effect is where you're going to get, because like if you look at especially Americans, although I think this is largely true of people in other countries, like people have like one issue they care about, you know, or two issues they care about. And, you know, those of us who have, you know, sophisticated attitudes about lots of different issues are unusual. So, you know, like, so to that end, there's a lot of people that are not persuadable, but sort of trainable, I guess.
Like the prompt would be something like, for the GPT prompt, be like, help this person rephrase their remark, but also, if you can, add in information that might support the position.
Yeah.
And then it's like this informational content.
Yeah.
Really
yeah, there's this, I mean, it's this question of whether information can persuade too, though, you know, I get just to completely contradict what I just said, you know, like there's this, you know, the other line of reasoning here, I think would be something like, well, information doesn't really persuade people. You know, you look at, you know, like many studies about COVID vaccine, for example, or something like that. Like the general consensus I take away from these studies is probably the last thing you should do is throw a bunch of science at someone, right? To convince them to take the vaccine. You shouldn't send them peer-reviewed studies. Rather, you should teach them what peer review is. And if you teach someone to understand how, you know, peer review happens and how, like, you know, how placebos are delivered and all this kind of stuff, then they will learn to accept the science. But if they don't have the style of thinking, right, then they can't absorb the evidence. So I think my gut says like style of thinking kind of interventions are probably would create bigger, to your earlier question, would create bigger effects. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I just totally contradicted myself in those two, which suggests I really don't know the answer, but I think both are pretty compelling stories. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, so much.
Thanks, everybody. Look forward to meeting you. Thanks for coming. And if you want to check out, if you didn't see the paper, it's on the archive, and I'll just throw up my email address here in case anybody wants to get a hold of me. And again, my big thank to my collaborators. This is an amazing team. If any of you are interested in this space, they've also done some really cool work on sort of social Turing tests, and did some of the early studies that had GPT-2 and 3 take surveys and demonstrated you can create sort of silicon samples. Really cool research group.